Welcome to Care for Creation, Laudato Si in Action, a reflection series presented by Ignatian Young Adult Ministries, an initiative of the Office of Ignatian Spirituality. Each week, we'll provide a short audio reflection connecting us to our individual and collective call to ecological justice. Let's pause and listen together for the stories that make us painfully aware of the truths of climate change. This week's reflection was written by Bryan P. Galligan, S.J. Bryan is a Jesuit scholastic of the East Province and was assigned to the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa, where he led advocacy efforts on food and climate justice and engaged in research on the sustainability of small-scale fisheries. In Laudato Si, Pope Francis issued a challenging invitation, encouraging us to pay attention to those questions which are troubling us and which we can no longer sweep under the carpet, so that we become painfully aware of what is happening to our planet and its people. When I was working for the Jesuit Justice and Ecology Network Africa, I was often forced to confront this kind of painful awareness. It was a rainy, muddy day in northern Malawi when I found myself meeting with a group of women and their village's chief. I was there to learn about the sustainable cooking practices they were using to avoid harvesting trees from the nearby forest. I learned a lot by listening to the women talk about their experience of sustainability, making a living from the land, and I was encouraged by their resilience and creativity. Then, as our meeting drew to a close, the chief got up to speak. He stood up from the circle we had formed on the floor of the village's gathering space, walked a few feet away, and placed himself in front of the neighbor's cornfield so that we could not look at him without also looking at the corn. He motioned to the field and began to explain how the village's planting cycle was structured around the annual rainy season that began each December. When the rains came, the community would plant their fields, and the rain would continue to feed the corn growing for months. But that year, the chief told us, the rains had arrived late. And then, when the community had planted their seeds, the rain stopped altogether. By the time they started again a couple of weeks later, the damage was already done. The crop was lost. Even as I listened, I knew that what I was hearing was this community's lived experience of a series of trends I had previously known only in terms of the clinical language of climate science. At this point, the chief looked me in the eye and said, "We do not know what we are going to eat this year." I felt like a hole had opened up in my chest, and I became painfully aware that I had never experienced the hunger of real deprivation. I knew that, once the meeting concluded, I would return to the Jesuit community in a pickup truck, take a hot shower, and eat meat for dinner with plenty of nsima, the Malawian staple food made of cornmeal. A few days after that, I would get on an international flight and return home to Kenya, emitting more carbon in a few hours than the average Malawian emits in a year. But I was not given much time to dwell on my sins. When the chief finished speaking, the women's group stood up and they gestured that I should do the same. And then we began to dance. One of the women would sing something in their native Chichewa, and then all the others would respond. We danced in a circle moving left and then right, contracting and expanding together to the beat of the women's feet and the sounds of their voices. And then I felt a hand wrap itself around mine and started pulling me towards the center of the circle, towards the center of the song, and the women began to dance around me. I heard them sing my name, the American syllables surrounded by Chichewa sounding about as awkward as I felt. But this was not the awkwardness of alienation or inequality. It was the awkwardness of an undeserved embrace. Later, a friend and colleague translated what the women had been singing to me. "Bryan," they repeated over and over, "go and tell our story." The goal of awareness, Pope Francis said, is not to amass information or to satisfy curiosity, but rather to dare to turn what is happening to the world into our own personal suffering, and thus to discover what each of us can do about it. You and I cannot go to Malawi and rescue the village's lost harvest. And there is nothing we can do to make sure this year's rainy season begins on time and continues through its usual end. But we can tell stories. And we can be inspired by those stories to advocate, donate, and vote in ways that support those most affected by climate change, by bringing an end to fossil fuel use, funding adaptation for small-scale food producers, and compensating frontline communities for irreparable loss and damage. As you continue to think about today's theme, we invite you to reflect on 2 questions. How is God inviting me to grow in painful awareness, to confront that which is swept under the carpet? How do I feel called to use the gifts God has given me to respond to that awareness? To download a PDF version of this reflection, including the reflection questions, please visit ignatianyoungadults.org/podcast. Thank you for joining us for this week's reflection on Painfully Aware. Join us next week when we'll contemplate the call to serve and preserve the earth.